Hello, in this quick video we're going to take a look at how to run a certification tool against an Azure VM image prior to submitting it through the Marketplace publishing process. There are two ways to run certification on a VM image, and this document describes the two options. One option that it describes pretty well is deploying a VM and then running a Windows based certification tool that has this type of GUI, and this tool can be installed from this download link on Windows machines. If you don't have a Windows machine, you can install it on a VM running in Azure, and then you point it to a Linux or Windows machine deployed from your image, and this tool runs and some tests against that VM and provides back an output. If you want to avoid having to install this tool, let's say you don't have a Windows machine and you want to execute the validation tests using an API, there is also a section of this document that describes an API. Right now, this section is going through some updates to fix some of the little typos here. So once this document is updated, you'll be able to see here exactly the steps that I'm describing in this video, but it's basically an API. So we will look at both ways really quickly to see how it works, primarily focusing on how to do the API approach, calling the API using Postman or curl commands that we'll include with this video. So let's take a look at the tool. So I installed the tool on my machine already, and the tool is called Certification Tool. So I'm going to start this tool. I'm going to go to start the next test, going to give it a name, test one, tell it I want to test a Linux machine using password. And it's saying which machine? Well, I have a machine running here that I deployed from an image. We'll pretend that that's my custom image. So we will specify the domain, the username, and my password. Okay, we'll say connect. It connected to the machine via SSH, and then it will execute these tests, right? So it's checking for some of the things and it's giving warnings or passes. And then on the next steps, this tool also has a little questionnaire to give you the best practices of what should be included in the image and what should not. Okay, so, and then at the end, it can save the result somewhere else. So that's how the tool works. Let's say you don't have a Windows machine or you don't want to deploy a Windows VM and install this tool on it, which takes a few minutes, literally. There is another way that we can do it. So let's take a look at how to do it. So I'm going to close this. Okay, and we are going to follow some of this documentation, which is not fully accurate yet, but let's look at the steps. So step number one, we are going to create in the Azure Active Directory, we just need to create an application or a service principal that we will use. So we'll do something really simple. We'll create one called self-test API. We'll make it single tenant. This is not really relevant because it's not going to be a web application. We're just going to use this for making calls to the API. So we create an application, single tenant. The main thing we will need is its identifier. And let's give ourselves a secret for this application as well. So we'll just say, make me secret one. And this secret will get generated. We'll copy this because it will not appear any longer, and we'll save it somewhere. Okay, and we'll also save our application client ID. Okay, and so that's our client ID, and we also need our Active Directory tenant ID, which is right over here. We'll need it for making that, for authenticating the calls. Great. So we got these pieces of information, and I have a Postman that I started creating here right before starting the video. So this is my tenant ID that I just copied, and I'm making a call to this token issuing endpoint. We are going to grab our client ID. We're going to grab our client secret that we created. That's the authentication. We're going to use a client credential grant. And very important part is we need to specify this specific resource identifier. That's what that API expects in the token, management.core.windows.net. And we're going to send this request. And what we'll get back from this request is an access token like that. Okay, this is the access token we will use for authenticating calls to the uh, self-test API. So here is a self-test API endpoint isv app.azurewebsites.net self-test-vm and the payload that it needs. Again, the documentation will include this clearly, but just to see, so you need the DNS name of the VM. That's the VM we are running. We'll need the username, the password, which operating system it is, which port it uses, our company name, and the app ID, that's the client ID, and the tenant we specified. And in addition, these are the same ones we just created for the application in the Active Directory. And we will also need to specify the token right over here that we got. So let's delete this token, grab this token instead. So I'm just copying and pasting this to show manually how to do these calls. Okay, and let's see if I send this request right now, it's missing the password and it's telling me, hey, you're missing all these fields. So let's pretend, and this is my secure password at 1234. Let's say it's my wrong password. And let's see what the validation will say. It will say, hey, you need the app ID and the tenant ID. So let's grab our app ID and put it here. And let's grab our tenant ID and put it here. And let's see what happens. So it's going to try to connect to the virtual machine, okay? But it's saying, hey, I could not connect to the virtual machine because the password was invalid, right? Basically, that's what this error over here is saying. Great. Let's also see what, let's just make this app ID invalid just to test what kind of errors you can expect. See, it says that the application failed because it wasn't recognized. The token needs to match that application. So now the password is invalid and it fails. Let's correct the password. So this is the valid password for this user on my test machine. And let's send the request. And hopefully we'll get back a successful response. It takes a little while, as you saw in that manual tool, it took a little while to run the tests. This is the response. It's giving you back a JSON object with two components, tracking ID and response. Response itself contains a JSON payload. So let's copy this somewhere and decode it and just take a look at what's inside. So this is going to be where we copy it. Let's clean it up a tiny bit because it has encodings here, so we'll replace that with this, and then we'll reformat this as JSON inside of Visual Studio Code to see what we got. We'll save it. So you can see this is our test run. It shows which VM version we got, when the test ran, it passed, and it shows the same tests we saw in that Windows tool that ran, and we can see those results right over here, and this is the test result. So we know, okay, our image is in good shape, it's passing, there's a couple warnings it might have given us, but it didn't fail us, and you can see the final result, right? So this is the idea. You can call this from your application or using curl, or using PowerShell, whatever makes sense for you, but that's basically the raw call that you make. And let's say your machine has only SSH key authentication. So the way you do that is, instead of specifying password here, we're going to grab our private key of the SSH, because the machine has the public key on it. We're just going to copy it instead of the password, just with these lines in there. And we're going to submit the request. And it's going to authenticate the API, server-side API will authenticate to the VM, and again, run the test successfully for us on it, and we got back the results, the same JSON that we got before. So that's basically it. So let's just recap real quick what we needed to do. And again, the document will be updated in the future to reflect all of that. We need the VM running from our image. Inside of an Active Directory tenant that we own, we create ourselves an application just for calling the API. That application needs to have a secret defined for it. And then we need the client ID, directory tenant, and the secret of the application. we call Active Directory token issuing endpoint. Right here is our tenant ID, client secret, and again, the main thing is this management core windows.net. Let's actually see what happens afterwards if we don't use correctly, but that's what we need for correct call. And then we make a post request with the payload, again, that will be in the document, with the password, the username and the location of the VM. Obviously, this VM needs to have port 22 open temporarily to be able to access it, and this is the client ID and a tenant ID that we needed. Let's do a quick test of what happens if we specify incorrect um, information here. So we're going to be able to get the token just fine, but when we call the endpoint will not be happy with that tenant. So let's just see if that's the error. We get back, and you can see that the audience validation failed. The audience we provided in that token doesn't match what's required, so the error message will be pretty clear to tell you how to fix it. So if we fix that to get the token correctly now, we're going to get the right token here, and this token will be useful right over here. This will fail due to password validation, but this error message will not be there anymore in the same way. See, it's error due to inability to connect via SSH. So hopefully this was helpful to see how to call an API called self-test VM. You can, basically automate this way, running tests against your VM, getting back a nice list of validation steps that it performed, saving it somewhere, and using it for submission of the VM into the marketplace. Thank you. Have a great day.